The Mark IV tank was not fast, refined, or comfortable, but it was the machine that helped make Cambrai one of the defining armored battles of the First World War. As I release my new book, Cambrai, The First Great Tank Offensive, alongside Season 1 of Famous Tank Battles, Cambrai, this article looks at the tank itself, the steel, smoke, machinery, and human endurance behind the famous attack. Cambrai is remembered because hundreds of tanks moved forward in a way the battlefield had never seen before. But that story begins with the Mark IV, a crude and remarkable machine that showed the world the future of armored warfare before anyone fully understood what that future would become.
The Mark IV tank was not fast, elegant, or refined. It did not look like the tanks that would dominate later battlefields, and it did not move with anything resembling modern armored speed. It was a grinding, rattling, smoke-filled machine built for one brutal purpose: to carry men and weapons across ground that had become almost impossible for infantry to cross alone.
By 1917, the Western Front had become a landscape of trenches, wire, shell holes, machine guns, and artillery fire. Armies could still launch attacks, but the cost was often staggering. The tank emerged from that problem. It was not created because warfare had become clean or mechanical. It was created because the battlefield had become so destructive that armies were desperate for a new way through it.
The Mark IV was Britain's most important step toward making the tank a usable weapon of war. Earlier tanks had shown promise, but they were still uncertain machines. The Mark IV remained uncomfortable, mechanically difficult, and vulnerable, but it could be built and deployed in numbers large enough to matter. That distinction made it more than an experiment.
Its defining moment came at Cambrai. In November 1917, British Mark IV tanks moved toward the German defenses in one of the first great demonstrations of massed armored attack. The battle did not solve every problem of trench warfare, but it changed how the tank was understood. After Cambrai, the Mark IV was no longer just a strange machine crawling across the mud. It was proof that armored warfare had a future.
The Mark IV existed because the old methods of attack were no longer enough. By the middle years of the First World War, infantry assaults often had to move through belts of barbed wire, broken ground, flooded shell holes, and carefully prepared machine gun positions. Even when artillery bombardments smashed parts of the enemy line, they also tore the battlefield into a maze of craters and mud that slowed the men who had to cross it.
The tank was an attempt to solve that problem with armor, tracks, and firepower. It was designed to go where horses, trucks, and traditional artillery support could not. A tank could crush wire, cross trenches, and carry weapons directly into the enemy's defensive zone. In theory, it gave attacking infantry something they had badly needed: a moving shield and a way to break through obstacles that had stopped so many advances before.
The Mark IV was not the first British tank, but it was an important improvement over the early models. The first tanks had shocked observers, but they were unreliable, difficult to move to the battlefield, and still experimental in both design and use. The Mark IV kept the same general shape, but it represented a more practical wartime machine. It could be manufactured in greater numbers, transported more effectively, and used in larger formations.
That mattered because the tank's value depended on more than invention. One or two machines could startle an enemy, but they could not change a battle. To matter, tanks had to appear in numbers, support a larger plan, and work with infantry and artillery. The Mark IV was the machine that helped make that possible. It gave Britain a tank that was still crude, but no longer merely theoretical. It was ready to be tested at scale.
What made the Mark IV different? The Mark IV looked strange because it came from a different stage of armored warfare. It had no turret, no sleek profile, and no resemblance to the faster tanks that would come later. Its long, rhomboid body wrapped the tracks around the entire hull, giving the machine its unmistakable shape.
That design was not meant for beauty. It was meant to climb, grip, and crawl across ground that had defeated almost everything else.
The great challenge was the trench. A tank that could not cross trenches had little value on the Western Front, so the Mark IV's length and track arrangement were central to its purpose. It was designed to move over broken earth, push through wire, and span gaps that would trap infantry or wheeled vehicles. In that sense, the Mark IV was less a vehicle in the modern sense and more a moving battlefield tool. Its weapons were carried in side-mounted sponsons rather than in a rotating turret. The male version carried small cannon and machine guns, giving it the ability to attack strongpoints, machine gun nests, and fortified positions. The female version carried machine guns and was intended more for suppressing enemy infantry. These labels sound unusual today, but they reflected how new the entire idea still was. Armies were not only building tanks, they were still figuring out what tanks were supposed to be.
The Mark IV's design also showed the limits of early tank thinking. It could break through wire and cross trenches, but it was slow, difficult to steer, and dependent on a crew working under miserable conditions. Its shape solved some battlefield problems while creating others. That tension is what makes the Mark IV so important. It was not a finished answer to mechanized war, but it was a serious step toward one.
To describe the Mark IV only from the outside is to miss much of its story. From a distance, it looked like an armored monster crawling across the battlefield. Inside, it was a cramped, deafening, exhausting place where the crew had to fight the enemy, the ground, and the machine itself.
The crew worked beside the engine in intense heat, surrounded by noise, fumes, vibration, and the smell of oil and metal. Visibility was poor. Communication was difficult. Every movement of the tank was physical and uncertain, and every decision had to be made inside a space that was more workshop than fighting compartment. The men inside were protected from rifle and machine gun fire, but they were not removed from danger.
A Mark IV crew also had to endure the fear of becoming trapped. The tank could break down, sink into mud, become stuck in a trench, or draw enemy artillery fire. If the machine stopped in front of the German line, it could quickly turn from protection into a steel prison. Even when the armor held, the crew could be battered by heat, fumes, concussion, and the strain of operating under fire.
That human experience matters because the Mark IV was not simply a technological milestone. It was a weapon operated by men who were being asked to trust a new kind of machine in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Cambrai would show what masked tanks could do, but every yard gained still depended on crews willing to push these machines forward into smoke, shellfire, and uncertainty.
The Mark IV's greatest strength was that it could do things infantry could not do alone. It could crush barbed wire, cross trenches, move through broken ground, and carry weapons forward under armor. Against riflemen and machine gun crews, that protection mattered. A defending soldier who had expected infantry in the open now faced a steel machine pushing directly through the obstacle belt.
It also had psychological power. The sight and sound of a Mark IV approaching could unsettle defenders who had never faced tanks in numbers. It was slow, but it did not need to be graceful to be frightening. On the right ground, with infantry close behind and artillery supporting the advance, it could help open a path through defenses that had once seemed almost immovable. But the Mark IV was still a fragile early machine. It could break down before reaching the enemy. It could become stuck in mud or trapped by difficult ground. It was vulnerable to artillery, field guns, mechanical failure, and poor coordination. Its armor offered protection, but not invincibility. Once a tank was isolated, disabled, or separated from supporting infantry, it could quickly become a target. That is why the Mark IV's story is not simply a story of invention. It is a story of learning,
The tank could help break into a defensive system, but it could not exploit success by itself. It needed infantry, artillery, engineers, supply, command, and reserves. Cambrai would prove both sides of that lesson. The Mark IV could help crack the front open, but victory required more than steel.
Cambrai became the Mark IV's defining battlefield because it showed what tanks could do when they were used in mass rather than scattered in small numbers. The British attack in November 1917 brought hundreds of tanks into the opening assault, giving the machine its first great opportunity to prove that it could be more than a battlefield curiosity. On ground better suited to tanks than the mud of Flanders, the Mark IV helped crush wire, cross trenches, and carry the attack into the German defensive system. The opening success was dramatic. Tanks helped create surprise and momentum, and for a brief moment they seemed to offer an answer to the deadlock that had consumed so many lives. The Mark IV did not move quickly, but speed was not its main contribution. Its value came from its ability to force a way through the barriers that had made infantry assaults so costly.
Yet, Cambrai also revealed the limits of the early tank. Machines broke down. Crews exhausted themselves. Infantry, artillery, cavalry, reserves, and supply all had to keep pace if a breakthrough was going to become a lasting victory. The Mark IV could help open the door, but it could not walk the entire army through it by itself.
That is why the Mark IV's legacy is so important. It was not the perfect tank. It was not the beginning of modern armored warfare in its finished form. It was something more transitional and, in some ways, more interesting. A crude but serious machine that forced armies to rethink what was possible on the battlefield. After Cambrai, the tank could no longer be dismissed as an odd experiment. The Mark IV had shown that armored vehicles, used in concentration and tied to a larger plan, could change the shape of battle. It was slow, harsh, unreliable, and dangerous to operate, but it pointed toward the future. The Mark IV was not the tank perfected. It was the tank becoming impossible to ignore. The Mark IV tank belonged to the rough first generation of armored warfare. It was loud, slow, uncomfortable, and mechanically uncertain. It did not end the stalemate by itself, and it did not make the battlefield simple. What it did was proved that the problem of trenches, wire, and machine guns could be attacked in a new way. That is why the Mark IV's story belongs beside the story of Cambrai. One explains the machine. The other explains the moment when that machine was tested at scale. At Cambrai, the Mark IV became more than a strange armored experiment. It became part of a larger turning point in how armies thought about movement, protection, firepower, and shock on the modern battlefield. This connection is also at the center of my new Famous Tank Battles project, beginning with Cambrai, the first great tank offensive. The book and companion podcast look beyond the simple image of tanks rolling forward and examine the battle as a human, tactical, and technological event. The Mark IV did not create modern armored warfare by itself, but at Cambrai, it helped make the future visible. The Mark IV was not the tank perfected, it was the tank becoming impossible to ignore.